Welcome back to Plants of the Gods. In this episode, we have the distinct honor of hearing from Dr. Joe Watkins, an archaeologist, anthropologist, author, and member of the Choctaw Nation. Dr. Watkins, an old friend of Dr. Plotkins, shares insightful views on a wide range of topics, including peyote, the Native American Church, shamans versus neo-shamans, cultural appropriation, and the future of Indigenous healing. This is an episode you won't want to miss.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast Plants of the Gods. I'm your host, Mark Plotkin, the president of the Amazon Conservation Team on the web at www.amazonteam.org. Today, we have not just a special guest, but a very special guest. To describe him very briefly, and I'll give a longer description a little later, he is my favorite Choctaw with a PhD. So let me introduce the topic at hand and then say a bit more about my dear friend Joe. The 21st century psychedelic renaissance has been marked by renewed scientific, cultural, and spiritual interest in psychoactive plant medicines. It's created an unprecedented enthusiasm around the globe. Clinical trials, retreats, and popular books now champion the use of hallucinogenic plants and fungi, from Ayahuasca to Yopo, from Banisteriopsis to Varroa, for healing trauma, treating addiction, and deepening spiritual insight. Yet for many indigenous peoples of the Americas, this isn't a renaissance, it's merely a continuation. Native Americans have never stopped using these sacred medicines. What is new is that the rest of the world is finally paying attention. As Lakota activist and attorney Chase Iron Eyes has said, quote, "Our medicines are not for your Instagram enlightenment." Sums it up in a sentence. Now, a bit more background on our guest today, Dr. Joe Watkins. Joe is a member of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. He is associated with the University of Arizona. He has been practicing anthropological archaeology for more than a half a century. He's a visiting professor at the Global Studies program at Hokkaido University in Japan, and his book, Indigenous Archaeology, American Indian Values and Scientific Practice, published in the year 2000, is considered a foundational work in establishing indigenous archaeology as an internationally acknowledged area of the discipline. His latest work, which is being published by the University of Arizona Press, is entitled Indigenizing Japan, the Ainu Past, Present, and Future. And he's authored other books as well, which I'll list in the show notes after the program. And let me conclude the introduction by saying he was awarded the Society for American Archaeology's Lifetime Achievement Award in April 2025. Thank you and welcome, Dr. Joe Watkins.
Thank you, Mark, and it's very good to be here and very good to talk with you again.
Well, I do have to answer a question which will undoubtedly arise in the mind of our listeners, which is how we met, because that's an interesting story in and of itself. About 25 years ago, some folks at Oklahoma running a program called OSLEP, which brings together gifted students from all over Oklahoma to focus on a topic for 1 week. It could be dinosaurs, it could be DNA technology, and they wanted to do a week on ethnobotany. So they called and invited me, and I said I would come to Oklahoma and teach for a week, but on one condition. I said I wanted to go to Anadarko, Oklahoma. And the woman, there was a pause, and she said, why would you want to go to Anadarko, Oklahoma? And I said, because that's where my mentor, Richard Schultes, went in 1936 and took peyote for the first time, which not only put him on the peyote road, it led him to the scientific discovery of the magic mushrooms of Mexico and ayahuasca as well. So it all began in Oklahoma, and Joe Watkins was my guide and remains my friend to the present day.
Yeah, that was an interesting trip. It was nice to go down that way. And actually on the trip down, I remember stopping beside the road and picking up a small kestrel hawk that had been hit by a car. And actually, I used those tail feathers to make a a fan for my wife. And so that every time I see that fan, it reminds me of that trip, Mark.
Well, I still remember that stop for the feathers as well, so it made an impression on both of us. So what I want to do today, Joe, is I want to get a Native American perspective on all of these plants and fungi and magical frogs. There's so much information, there's so much nonsense on the web and in other manifestations of the current media. But let's go to the source. How are you guys feeling? What are you thinking about this? I mean, obviously there's positive aspects like the validation of sacred knowledge, the importance of indigenous wisdom and these plants and these fungi. But what are you guys thinking when you have something that was discouraged or forbidden just a few decades back and is now being championed and profaned by being sold on the internet?
Yeah, it's an interesting situation. We try to figure out what's going on. And I will say this from the beginning, that I don't speak for every American Indian that's out there. My background is informed both by training from my grandmother, who was very traditional and taught me a lot about different varieties of plants down in southeastern Oklahoma, as well as just the basic Western medicine and Western knowledge. So much of my perspectives and ideas comes from that amalgam, if you will, of miscellaneous backgrounds. I do find that kind of hard to say, but this really is nothing new. If for those of you as old as I am who will remember from 50 years ago when the so-called Carlos Castaneda came out and was writing about the teachings of Don Juan, so many people at that time really jumped on the bandwagon of, well, let's go try peyote, let's do this, let's do that. And so at that time, there were a large number of college students who really fell into the idea of experiencing natural, both natural ways of knowing, but also alternative ways of medicine. So anthropology, ethnopharmacology, ethnoarchaeology have all contributed to the historic background that we are seeing now with this, again, the Renaissance, the revival in looking at traditional medicines all around the globe.
Well, you know, the name Carlos Castaneda keeps coming up in many ethnobotanical discussions. And when I'm asked if it was true or not, if it was accurate, I always respond that there are valuable lessons to be learned from the Bible, whether all that stuff happened or whether it was exaggerated or whether it's a pure fable. So I think Carlitos did us all a favor by calling attention to the potential of Native American knowledge and hallucinogens, but I think he did a disservice by claiming a lot of things which clearly were not true, like magic mushrooms growing in the desert. So it goes back to your answer, like, well, I can't speak for all Native Americans, and I find this very frustrating when people say to me, well, what do indigenous peoples in the Amazon want? Well, that's 400 tribes, and that's like saying, what do Americans want? We can't agree on much these days. So I'm glad you pointed out this idea that, you know, no one person can speak for an entire tribe, much less an entire culture. But how are people thinking in terms of the youth? Because I've been working with indigenous peoples a long time, and a major challenge is the youth of the groups that I work with in South America, where they become excited by iPhones and iPads, as we all do, but in a way which tends to turn them away from traditional knowledge and culture. And I'm wondering if this psychedelic renaissance, so-called, is getting kids amongst the Choctaw, the Kiowa, or the Yanomami more interested in their ways for a variety of reasons.
I think many indigenous young people are really caught up in technology and time. And I've also found over the course of my lifetime that we kind of see generational shifting. We see the youth, the young people. There are always people within the youth who are extremely interested in tradition. They're extremely interested in carrying on the culture that they are being taught by, most of the time, their grandparents. And then we see, say, 95% of the people who are really interested in contemporary society. They want to get everything that everybody else has. They want to blend in. But then also, with many of the people I've run across and really talked with, we find that as that generation gets older, as they realize that the older generations are disappearing, some of that knowledge is disappearing, they often come back. And they often come back with a vengeance, to say it. They come back and they want to learn everything that they can. They become culture savers. And, it's again, it seems like the generations kind of switch back and forth. And many of the youth will come back, and they do become sometimes overly protective of the cultures that they've come to know.
Yeah, I as an ethnobotanist with an emphasis on the botanist, the analogy I would use is that of saving the seed corn. And what worries me, particularly in Amazonia, where much of the stuff is not written down, there isn't a written language, is that, the old people die off forgotten, and then these young people get a little older and they come back wanting to learn the old ways, whether it's medicinal plants or how to weave a backpack, and the old guys are gone. So that knowledge cannot be recreated. If the Library of Congress burned down today, virtually everything in there is recorded somewhere else. But in some of these indigenous groups, some of the particularly small ones, when that knowledge is gone, unlike the dinosaur DNA in Jurassic Park, you can't recreate it.
Exactly, Mark. I agree with you. I know that there are some people who are really devoted to saving as much of traditional culture as they can. They are devoted to recording things, to going out, talking to elders, and they are contributing a great deal of information. But that's really only one in maybe 1 in 1,000. And so it does get scary. I have found that even within my family at this point in time, I'm the oldest living person in my family, and I'm 74, and I have quite a bit of knowledge that was given to me from my grandmother and my uncle, but not nearly as much as there is out there. I've forgotten so much much more than I can remember.
So tell me, Joe, if you will, the perspective within these tribal communities of what I call pseudo-shamans or neo-shamans who take ayahuasca for a weekend at Esalen and proclaim that they're ayahuasca masters, and also your perspective on indigenous peoples who don't really follow the sacred path but see this as an easy source of money and girls if they start leading ayahuasca ceremonies, which they're not trained to do.
Yeah, it's very much a problem. Many traditional leaders among the Choctaw recognize that there are a lot of different people and that many people are gullible enough to believe that they can take a weekend ceremony and then that they know everything there is to know about things. Many of those traditional leaders feel sorry for the individuals who do try to find the quick pathway to enlightenment or whatever they want to call it. I've found that in discussions with many of the older traditional leaders, they really feel sorry for those who want to find the quick pathway. And they are also very concerned about outsiders who want to come in and use teachings of the tribe as a means of either becoming economically beneficial, but also using those teachings to help push their own sorts of agendas. And what many of the traditional leaders have done is to say, basically, thanks but no thanks. And so they've refused to work with such people, and they won't really go publicly and say, we don't support this. They generally just step back and try not to get involved in those discussions.
You know, in studying peyote in my college ethnobotany classes, I remember well my favorite quote, which is from the great Comanche chief Quanah Parker, who was, I think, the last war leader of the Comanche and ended up becoming a personal friend of Teddy Roosevelt. I mean, surely there's a great movie to be made of his story. But he explained the thirst for non-indigenous interest in hallucinogenic plants by saying, the white man goes into his church and talks about Jesus. We go into the Native American church and talk to Jesus.
Right.
So share with me your perspective on the fact that this sacred little cactus is being overloved, over-harvested by these people who may be well-meaning but are just think if it's growing somewhere in the desert, I should be able to pick it and eat it. To hell with the impact on the rest of the population or to the indigenous peoples to whom it's sacred.
Yeah, it's a very difficult situation. I've known quite a few peyoteros who would take the journey from Oklahoma down to Texas and the Rio Grande Valley, and I've been apprised of some of the ceremonies that they take part in and some of the ritual involved in harvesting the plant. But it's difficult to say. Most of those people had a true calling. They recognized that harvesting the sacrament was an important part of the church ceremony, that the ceremony extended beyond just within the confines of a teepee on one Saturday night. It was that connection to the earth, to the ground. They recognized that they had a very important part in bringing the plant out of its native environment, transporting it to the churches where it could become a part of the sacrament. I've been involved in Native American-led peyote rituals as well as non-Native American-led rituals. And I've recognized that the true practice of peyote does bring with it a sense of serenity. It brings a connection. It is a way that the people who truly practice it in the methods that it was initially created, I guess, do recognize its importance, and they are not ones to misuse it. But when it does get commercial, I would suggest that people just get mescaline and use the synthetic version rather than actually using the plant itself.
Well, Michael Pollan, who's written a couple of important books on hallucinogens, pointed out that San Pedro cactus is pretty widespread, and that's full of mescaline. So the idea that, no, you have to go and take the few peyote plants that are left is really quite a foolish one. Again, you can't get carried away with this stuff in the sense that ayahuasca is essentially a weed in terms of its commonality. I mean, I've seen it growing all over Hawaii, for example. So some of these plants are very endangered and some of them are not. And you can sometimes, like you said, find the alkaloids you're looking for in other places, whether they're synthetic or in other plants. And I think this is one way that science, even divorced from indigenous wisdom, can complement indigenous wisdom and result in a win-win scenario. In other words, if you are opting for mescaline, it should be easy to find outside of peyote. But I also want to circle back to this idea that just taking one alkaloid out of one plant or fungus gives you the totality of the experience. And I'll give you a personal example. About 25 years ago, I was asked to give the commencement address at Tulane Medical School. And to prepare for my commencement address, I went and interviewed the oldest Inga shaman from the Sibundoy Valley of Colombia, which is the cradle of ayahuasca shamanism. And I said, how long did it take you to learn to be a Taita shaman. And he looked at me and he said, well, in your years, I'm 93. He said, I'm still learning.
Exactly.
So this issue of the way we teach medicine in this country, which is 3 years and you're done, I think is very short-sighted to the Native American experience. So I'm curious, just to circle back, you said you learned a lot of stuff from your grandmother. Did she sit you down and say, this is the way it is? Or were you out on the res collecting plants and she would sort of point stuff out over her shoulder?
Well, definitely not sitting down. My grandmother probably spoke about maybe 100 words of English.
Mm-hmm.
I spoke maybe enough Choctaw to get my face slapped occasionally. But most of the time, it was when we were out walking. She would, we'd be going down to the river to bathe or walking through the swamps of southeastern Oklahoma. And she would point at a plant and kind of sometimes through pantomime about point at my tooth and say, when hurt there, and she'd point at it, and then she'd talk about barks of trees and so on and so forth. So it was very much out in the field. It was definitely not structured. My brother and sister and I, normally they might have been there. I don't have a lot of memory of them being at places when I learned about plants, but I was pretty much always interested in what she had to say, or at least I think occasionally the pantomime routines she went through to try to explain the plants were just as comedic as they were educational.
Well, when I first went to the Amazon in 81 or 82, I went to a village where there were about 7 or 9 of the last great shamans, but they had no apprentices. Their kids, their grandkids were not interested in learning the old ways. And what happened was I had guys my age, that is mid-20s, who I paid to be my guides and translators. And after a couple of decades, they had absorbed more information than I had, and one of them's gone on to be a full-fledged shaman. The point being is that the end point we're trying to aim for here at the Amazon Conservation Team and elsewhere is that the ethnobotanists and the shamans should be the kids and the grandkids in the tribes themselves. So how can we best enable and encourage kids amongst the Choctaw, kids amongst the Ngano to pick up the staff, to get on the path and honor and practice their own traditions?
I think the difficulty lies in the fact that we definitely are, here in the United States anyway, in a capitalistic society that requires that even children earn money in order to contribute either to the household, to their own education, but also the way they earn money needs to provide them with that educational opportunity, if at all possible. So I think one way the Choctaws are doing, every year, every summer, they have 2 or 3 what are called culture camps, where children, young adults of certain ages, spend time with traditional people within the tribe in a week-long campfire situation where part of the day is spent learning about plants, part of the day is spent learning about traditional technologies, part of the day is spent listening to stories, language immersion, all these things that, say, maybe 200 years ago, Choctaw youth would have participated in a full-time situation. What we are finding is that many of the students who take these culture camps, at least among the Choctaw, come back year after year, and they're learning their language very quickly. They are becoming language speakers. They're no longer relying on television and the radio for entertainment. They're actually talking amongst themselves, and they're talking with elders. So we are getting perhaps a neo-traditional generation of learners, and I find that very much a positive situation. So in some ways, if we could develop a sense of maybe traditional internships, something like that would help pave the way for these young learners to gain some funding to be able to help them pay for school further down the line.
Well, our Shamans Apprentice program, particularly in the Northeast Amazon, has been very successful in creating a new generation of shamans. And when I say shamans, I mean within the local indigenous groups themselves, taught by elders in their own tribe. And we've had some small efforts to connect North American and South American peoples, which have been a small scale but very successful. So my challenge to our listeners today, if you will support the Amazon Conservation Team to build a bridge between the Amazon and the Choctaws, we'll make it happen, and we'll report in a follow-up podcast. So I want to make this podcast an interactive exercise, and all of you, instead of sitting there saying, oh, isn't that too bad, the challenge is in front of you, how to make this happen and how to move forward in a positive way based on successful and proven methodologies.
Cool.
So I would like to hear from you, Joe, your take on these ethical and legal issues, anthropological issues, facing us as we go into the future. Clearly, there's going to be more and more demand for these hallucinogenic, entheogenic substances. Clearly, there aren't enough real shamans to go around. How do we balance? Where's the sweet spot? What should us outside of Native communities be doing or thinking, and what should you inside of these communities be thinking or doing to build that bridge and build a brighter tomorrow?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question, trying to figure out what that balance is going to be. I think many people who have been involved in traditional learning vacillate. They believe, they recognize that it's important to share culture, but they also recognize that there are parts of culture that should only be available to the people born into that culture. So there's that issue to begin with. Beyond that, you have people who are very well educated, people who truly believe that it's the responsibility of those with education to share with everyone globally that much of that information belongs to humanity as a very broad, species-wide group of living organisms. So we have conflict there, built-in conflict. We have tribal groups who believe that their language is so important that they don't want anyone else to have it. And we have some groups like the Choctaw who believe that everybody in the world should learn Choctaw because in that way they will better understand who the Choctaw are, who the Choctaw have always been, and who the Choctaw will be in the near future. So it is very much an ethical issue, and it's going to be ongoing. We're going to have groups among the Choctaw who are going to say, we welcome everyone. We want us all to be a part of the same human family. There are other people who will say, we don't welcome anyone unless you are Choctaw and you really want to embrace this lifestyle. And that's going to be an individual decision as much as, unfortunately, may become a governmental or a legal decision. I'm hoping that we can keep it more on an ethical situation and not really have to worry about a tribal government making laws against the practice of traditional culture by anyone except by tribal people.
You know, you hit on a key issue here about sharing. What do you share and what don't you share? One of the things the Amazon Conservation Team is best known for is our ethnographic mapping, which is we teach the people how to make a map, but they make their own map. And I was out hunting with one of my good friends from the trio group, and we took a break and we're crossing a stream, and I looked down, and Joe, the thing sparkled with gold. I mean, it was the Amazon version of the Yellow Brick Road. It was gold from one side to the other. And I looked down, and I looked up at him, and I said, "Is this what I think it is?" And he goes, "Yep." And I said, "We're not putting this on the map, are we?" He goes, "Absolutely not." So this idea of knowing how to deal with the outside world and knowing what absolutely is not to be shared is, I think, one of the best ways we can help our colleagues deal with the outside world on their own terms. And I'll give you a positive example of that. A couple of years later, this anthropologist showed up in the village, and she sought out the same guy who's a shaman's apprentice and said, "I know you have a book of your medicinal plants in your language." And he said, "Yes, we do." And she said, "Bring it to me." And he looked at her and he said, "No." And she said, "Why not?" And he said, "Because I don't know you and I don't trust you." And I thought, yes, success, right? So the idea that all outsiders are bad or all outsiders are good is equally foolish. And to be able to deal with the outside world on your own terms, your own sense of nobility, the value of your own culture, and the understanding that, to quote one of my least favorite presidents, you should trust but verify, or maybe misquote him, don't trust but verify might be a better way of describing it.
I agree with you totally. And I think that the one thing that we need to recognize is that these things become, basically, it's a practice of tribal sovereignty, it's intellectual sovereignty, it's individual sovereignty. And I think it's important that we, both as researchers but also as individuals, believe that we have to give individuals their sovereignty to make those decisions, but we can provide them with a background to make the informed decisions.
Well, I want to wind down on two touchy subjects, and one of those is cultural appropriation. We all agree that cultural appropriation can be very bad. We all agree that it's been way too common. We all agree that we have to have clear guidelines so that nobody's taking advantage of anybody. But corn, for example, was being grown from Alaska to Argentina prior to the odious Columbus's appearance. Okay? Now, corn is native to Mexico and Guatemala. So other indigenous groups were using corn that they didn't domesticate. Okay, so where can we draw the line here? I mean, if pasta was invented by the Chinese, and I know there's debate about that, should the Italians be producing pasta? And I'm giving ridiculous examples, but I do think that if you pursue this thing to the logical or illogical end, it shows you that this isn't a simple thing to solve. So share with us your perspective on this whole issue of cultural appropriation.
Well, I think cultural appropriation is probably the extreme of a couple of things you hinted at in terms of cultural appreciation. Yeah, we recognize that we really do appreciate the cultural costumes, cultural outfits. We can appreciate cultural ceremonies. But when we start taking those and practicing them and really saying that we know more about the other group, if we were to say, I wear feathers because I really believe that this bird spirit talked to me, and therefore I have the right to wear these bald eagle feathers. Well, I think that probably 99.9% of the population would say, "Dude, you're crazy." But
count me in.
But we do recognize that as part of culture is so many interconnected things. It's language, it's foresight, it's hindsight, it's stories, it's ceremony, it's lifetimes, it's not genetics. It's everything that we learn that individual cultures have been developed over time to help groups adapt to their environment, to the things that they need to survive. Today, I think that the majority of the people in the Western world can survive with a very general mishmash of Western culture, of transportation, telephones, telegraph. They don't really know how to survive without everything being provided for them. I'm definitely not an expert on cultural appropriation, but as people have said in the past, I may not be able to identify it, but I know it when I see it.
And that was originally one of the Supreme Court justices talking about pornography, but
Exactly.
I think the analogy stands. So the last thing I want to ask you about, Dr. Joe Watkins, is what's a difficult issue for all ethnobotanists and others. I was teaching a class online during the pandemic, and one of the students held up her electronic hand and said, "You used the word Indians. You can't use that word." And I replied, "Look, I understand you're raising this issue, but let me tell you what I try and do. I call people by what they want to be called. I grew up in the segregated South. I remember segregated water fountains. When I was a kid, if you called somebody a Negro, you were considered enlightened. If you do it now, you're likely to get smacked in the mouth. So what people tell me they want to be called or don't want to be called is my rule of thumb. Now, the people I work with in the bush in Suriname call themselves Ingis. The people that I work with in the bush in Brazil call themselves Indios. The people that I work with in Colombia say Indios. So what is the proper term so you're not upsetting anybody, but you're not calling people in Suriname by a name that they wouldn't recognize, which would be First Americans, for example?"
Right. I tell people, I will step back a little bit. I, too, have been castigated for using the term Indian. However, I was born in 1951 in Oklahoma, and I was born an American Indian. At that time, First Nations, Native Americans, those terms weren't appropriate. So I've always been American Indian. I guess I should say I'm Choctaw first, then American Indian. As a third term, I will say Native American, but I don't really use that when applying it to myself unless I'm in a formal situation where someone else kind of uses that term. I guess my favorite point is Vine Deloria Jr., a good friend and a very important person in the castigation of anthropologists back in 1969, said that he's always been American Indian and he would change the way he portrays himself whenever the National Congress for American Indians changes their name to National Congress for Native Americans. So
Got it.
I think that, as you say, the important thing is to call people by the terms that they would prefer to be called. And again, I'm American Indian. I'm Native American sort of under further explanation.
Well, that is a beautiful summation of what is a very difficult topic for many people. So now if I say something and people don't like it, I can blame you.
Please do. Have them write me.
So to conclude, Dr. Joe Watkins, I'd like to thank you for your time. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. I always learn something when I'm with you or talk with you, and I want to leave the door open to do follow-up. I'd love to talk more about the Ainu once the book is out. But I want to leave our listeners with a lot of answers, but even more questions. So that's the point of Plants of the Gods. We're not here to answer all your questions. We're here to answer some of your questions and challenge you so you have more questions, which is an excuse to invite my friend Joe Watkins back on the program. So in conclusion, as I said, I will list all of Joe's books in our show notes so you're able to find more information. And I want to conclude with a great quote from an Indigenous leader who was asked about the Western likelihood or capability or always distilling things down beyond its essence. They just want the alkaloids. They don't want the plants and the shamanic chants. And this fellow said with regard to hallucinogens, you have to understand this is not a trip. This is a path.
Amen.
So thank you, Joe Watkins. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Thank you for listening to another compelling episode of Plants of the Gods. If you enjoyed this and other episodes, please post a positive review and recommend it to friends and family. And please support the Amazon Conservation Team at www.amazonteam.org, which not only makes this ad-free podcast possible, but which partners with Indigenous colleagues to help them protect both their cultures and their ancestral rainforests.